By the mid-80s, cadres of industrial workers had formed in Russia. For the years 1861, 1881 years, the number of workers doubled, reaching by 1881 668,000 people. The process of concentration has increased. More than half of the total number of workers worked in large factories. There were such large enterprises as the Kremlomskaya manufactory near Narva, where up to 9,000 workers worked. Smelting cast iron in Russia after the reform. Gornyatsky dwellings of the 70s in Yuzovka. The industrial proletariat was a new social class, brought to life by the development of industrial capitalism. The industrial proletariat, unlike serf workers and small artisans, was united in large factories and factories. This facilitated his struggle against the capitalists and Tsarism. The situation of workers. Workers in the 60s and 70s were subjected to cruel exploitation. Female and child labor was widely used. Children from educational homes were sent to factories, mines and mines. The working day was not regulated by law. Usually it was 14 hours, but sometimes reached 16 and even 19 hours. The work of adolescents at the Krenolm textile manufacture lasted from 4 am to 8 p.m., i.e. 16 hours. The number of injuries due to worker fatigue and the lack of labor protection was very high, as the cars were not fenced and cleaned on the move. For a long working day, workers received insignificant wages. At the Kremlomskaya manufacture, teenagers received salaries of 4 rubles per 16-hour day per month, but only 8 cents were given to them on a monthly basis. The owner of the factory took for the maintenance of adolescents for 6 rubles, 50 kopecks, per month. Therefore, after a month of work, the teenager still owed to the manufacturer 2 rubles, 58 kopecks. This duty to the worker had to work for many years. The average wage of workers throughout Russia at this time was 14 rubles, 16 kop, per month for an adult male and 10 rubles, 35 kop, for an adult woman. The greater part of the workers received wages in the amount of 7-8 rubles per month. In a number of districts, the salary was even lower. In the Urals, the average salary of an adult worker was only 4 rubles, 80 kop, per month. But even this insignificant salary was not received by the workers all at once, sometimes only 2-3 times a year. There were no fixed dates for the issue of wages. Part of the wages, up to 74.7 the manufacturers kept by ruthlessly fining the workers. The fines were imposed on the workers quite arbitrarily. Manufacturers also often cheated workers when issuing salaries. Workers were forced to borrow very bad food products from the factory shop at prices 2 to 3 times higher than market prices. Workers lived hungry. They ate only potatoes, cabbage and black bread. They did not see any oil, meat or sugar. The housing conditions were extremely difficult. The workers were forced to live in factory apartments in the factory territory. In small rooms there were 10-12 people. The manufacturers also made a source of profit from this, subtracting from the salary of workers and increased rent. The manufacturers established rules for these apartments, for violation of which the workers were mercilessly fined. In addition, the workers were under constant surveillance. Without the permission of the overseers, the worker could not leave the factory territory even after work, and also on a holiday. In the most difficult situation were the textile workers who had not yet broken ties with the village and worked in factories only in the winter, and in the spring they returned to the countryside for field work. The monstrous exploitation of the workers gave the manufacturers enormous profits. In Russia, as elsewhere, capitalism grew on the bones and blood of workers. 50. External policy of CAREZIS in the 60s-70s. The international situation of Tsarism after the Crimean War. The defeat at Sevastopol put an end to the rule of Tsarism in European politics. Tsarism remained the gendarme of Europe, but it gradually became an agent of Western European capital. Among the Western European states, Tsarist Russia was no longer the dominant position, as before, but a dependent one. In its foreign policy, Russia sought to free itself from the humiliating articles of the Paris Treaty of 1856, which prohibited it from having a navy on the Black Sea, building naval shipyards, arsenals and coastal fortifications. In order to get assistance from Germany, Tsarism concluded in 1863 a convention with Prussia, which supported Alexander II during the uprising in Poland. In turn, the alliance with Russia helped Prussia win victories in wars with Austria and France and created a unified German Empire, 1871. Taking advantage of the defeat of France during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, the Tsarist government declared that it did not consider itself bound by the restriction of its rights established by the Paris Peace Treaty in 1856 with respect to defense activities on the Black Sea. The British protest against the violation of the Paris Treaty was not supported by other states. In 1871, the London Conference of Powers convened, which formalized the abolition of the humiliating articles of the Treaty of Paris for Russia, with the exception of the Convention on the Åland Islands, which prohibited the construction of fortifications on them and remained in force until 1914. Tsarist Russia was a prison of nations. Tsarism was a strangler and executioner of non-Russian peoples, whose lot was political deprivation, humiliation and insults. The non-Russian peoples were officially called aliens, mercilessly eradicated the slightest manifestation of national independence. But this colonialist policy of Tsarism did not meet the sympathy and support of the Russian people. Tsarism did not represent the Russian nation. Its true representatives were those best Russian people who considered it their patriotic duty to unite all the peoples around the Russian people for a joint struggle against the common enemy, Tsarism. The friendship of the peoples was at that time the dream of the best people of Russia. This friendship, which was born in the joint struggle against external and internal enemies before October 1917, grew and consolidated only the jostle of the Great October Socialist Revolution. The Narodnik movement of the 70s. The peasantry, completely dissatisfied with the reform of 1861, continued to fight for land in the 60s and 70s. It demanded a black distribution, i.e., the destruction of landed estates and the transfer of all land to the peasants. Before the emergence of Marxist groups, the Narodniks conducted revolutionary work among the workers and among the peasants in Russia, who did not understand the advanced role of the working class. Therefore the Narodniks tried to raise only the peasants to fight for land and freedom against the landlords and Tsarism. This struggle they gave all their strength, and often their lives. But all the actions of the Narodniks were unsuccessful, because they were going the wrong way. The populists were opponents of Marxism. Their main erroneous views were as follows. Firstly, the Narodniks maintained that capitalism in Russia represents an accidental phenomenon, that it will not develop in Russia, and consequently the proletariat will not grow and develop. Secondly, the Narodniks did not consider the working class to be the advanced class in the revolution. They dreamed of achieving socialism without the proletariat. The Narodniks considered the main revolutionary force to be the peasantry, led by the intelligentsia, and the peasant community, which they regarded as the germ and the basis of socialism. Thirdly, the Narodniks had an erroneous and harmful view of the whole course of human history. They did not know and did not understand the laws of the economic and political development of society. They were absolutely backward people in this respect. In their opinion, history is not made by classes or the struggle of classes, but only by certain outstanding personalities, the heroes, behind whom the masses, the crowd, the people, the classes are blindly walking. A short course in the history of the CPSU, BP 1314. Proceeding from these erroneous propositions, the revolutionaries, disguised as peasant clothes, went to the people in the spring of 1874, that is, to the villages, for revolutionary agitation. For this, going to the people. They were called populists. The peasants listened to the calls of the Narodniks to take away the landed land, but hostile to the calls to overthrow the Tsar. The police, reactionary clergy and kulaks caught the propagandist populace. Walking to the people suffered a complete collapse. The Narodniks, who survived the arrests, created in 1876 a centralized secret organization, Land and Freedom, organized by G. V. Plekhanov, V. N. Finner, Nat Anson, Esperovskaya and others. Land and Freedom accepted the populist program. At the heart of this program lay the anarchist doctrine of Bakunin, which denied any benefit to the masses from political freedoms and democratic order. Ma Bakunin, 1814-1876, the son of a noble landowner, emigrated abroad in the 1940s. There he promoted the liberation of all Slavic peoples and the creation of a Slavic federal state. After his arrest for his participation in the revolutionary movement of Germany and Austria in 1848-1849, Bakunin was extradited to Austria by the Tsarist government and imprisoned in the Schlüsselburg fortress. In the prison, Bakunin wrote a penitential confession for Nicholas I, in which he explained his revolutionary enthusiasms, immaturity of mind and heart, and also wrote penitential letters to Alexander II. In 1857, he was released and sent to settle in Siberia, but in 1861 he managed to flee abroad. Abroad, Bakunin was admitted to the International Workers' Association. He promised Marx to help this new revolutionary organization. However, in fact, he did not abandon his schismatic activity and founded the secret society, International Alliance of Social Democracy, with an anarchist program. This secret organization waged a struggle against Marx and disorganized the international working class movement. By his splitting activity, Bakunin contributed to the death of the First International. Bakunin had a negative influence on the Russian revolutionary movement. He believed that the Russian masses were ready for revolution, and only sparking agitation was needed that would ignite a general revolt fire. As an anarchist and rebel, Bakunin denied the necessity for the proletariat and the peasantry of the political struggle and the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat, demanded the immediate annihilation of every state. His program and tactics were erroneous and harmful. Another theorist of populism was P. L. Lavrov, 1823-1900. Lavrov was also the son of a rich landowner. Arrested in the 60s, he was sent into exile. In 1869 he published his historical letters under the pseudonym Murdova. In them he gave an idealistic explanation of history, placing in the center of the historical process a critically thinking person, that is, a hero, as opposed to the passive mass, the people, the crowd. In March 1870, Lavrov fled from exile abroad. Although Lavrov was familiar with K. Marx and his works, he did not understand Marxism. He argued that Russia could come to socialism bypassing capitalism, since the Russian peasant was allegedly prepared for socialism as a political tradition of the community and the ardel. In contrast to Bakunin, Lavrov called for peaceful propaganda of socialism. Lavrov's sermon on the return of duty to the people, the work of which created the entire civilization, fascinated the Narodnik youth of the 70s and served as a theoretical justification for its walking to the people. The third theorist of Narodism was P. N. Kakayev, 1844-1885. He maintained that the Tsarist autocracy had no social support, that it hangs in the air. Kakayev considered the task of the revolutionaries to be the forcible seizure of power by a small group of conspirators, who would then carry out revolutionary measures from above and thus favor the people. In the opinion of Kakayev, such a group of conspirators could have reconstructed the entire social order on their own. Kakayev's views on the role and importance of the community as the basis of the socialist revolution in Russia aroused sharp criticism of Engels in the article, Social Relations in Russia, in which he exposed the reactionary idealization of the Narodnikship of the Ardelian community. Engels pointed out that the community everywhere was a natural support for despotism. Populism in Ukraine and in Georgia. Narodnik ideas and organizations have spread in Ukraine and Georgia. In the 1970s, the struggle of peasants for land was aggravated in Ukraine. The landlords at this time made the demarcation of their lands from peasants, taking away the best land from the peasants and giving them wastelands and sands. The Ukrainian peasants, like the Russians, demanded the universal distribution of land and the granting of peasants to it. Ukrainian Raznikincy created populist circles for work among peasants and intelligentsia. From the Bakunin rebels formed the so-called Kiev Commune, counting on an immediate revolution in the countryside. Ukrainian rebels decided even to deceive and use the peasants' faith in the Tsar. They distributed in the Kuzhirinsky district of the Kiev province on behalf of the Tsar a golden letter printed in an underground populist typography. In this letter they urged the peasants to create a secret organization and promised to give them all the land on behalf of the Tsar. Deception soon became known to the peasants, and this pushed them away from the Narodniks. In the 1970s, the populist ideas spread among the Georgian democratic youth. There was no community in Georgia, but the Georgian populace, following the Russians, also demanded the organization of artels and the planting of communal land use, considering the community the only way to socialism. In 1876 the Georgian Narodnik organization was defeated by gendarmes. Some of the Georgian populace took part in the all-Russian struggle of the Narodniks. But some Georgian populace were against combating the struggle with the Russian people, and they defended the organization of an independent Transcaucasian federation outside Russia. In 1880, among the Narodniks of Georgia, there was a current that denied the revolutionary struggle and called for only legal methods of action. The People's Will. In 1878, in the Narodnik organization, Land and Freedom, under the influence of the failure of Walking to the People, heated debates began. What to do next? A part of the Narodniks called for completely abandoning the struggle for land, moving only to terror and organizing, first and foremost, the murder of the Tsar. The other part tried to stay on the old populist positions. In the autumn of 1879, the supporters of Narodism in its old form formed the Black Distribution Party, which soon ceased to exist because of the total impossibility of continuing the struggle in the stern Narodnik forms. The supporters of terror organized the party, Narodnaya Volia, headed by Zhelyabov, Sofia Perovskaya, V.N. Finner in St. Petersburg. Narodovoltsy set out to kill Alexander II. Several attempts were made against the Tsar. The most significant was the attempt in February 1880 in the Winter Palace. Here the working populist Stepan Kulchurin made an explosion, from which the king survived accidentally. After this attempt, Alexander II appointed General Loris Melikov a dictator to fight the revolutionary movement and subordinated to him all the ministries and the third branch. Loris Melikov made minor concessions to the bourgeoisie. He somewhat softened censorship for the bourgeois liberal press, dismissed the hated Minister of Education, Count D. Tolstoy. For this the bourgeoisie considered him a liberal. But the persecution and executions of the revolutionaries increased with him. Loris Melikov closed the third branch, but in exchange established for the same purpose a police department under the Ministry of the Interior. Loris Melikov promised to convene Zemstvo representatives to a meeting with officials for preliminary discussion of some draft laws. For such a policy, small concessions to the bourgeoisie and a decisive struggle against the revolutionary movement, the behavior of Loris Melikov was described by contemporaries as foxtail and wolf mouth. On March 1, 1881, the Narodnaya Volia killed Alexander II. The mass movement did not cause terror. There were no speeches on the part of workers and peasants. Instead of Tsar Alexander II, the throne was taken by his son Alexander III, who from the very first days led a decisive battle with the revolutionaries. All this clearly convinced most of the Narodniks that the tactics of individual terror were deeply mistaken and extremely harmful. She proceeded from the false theory of active heroes and a passive crowd expecting to be saved from single heroes. The crowd, the Narodniks and Narodnaya Volia, considered the people, that is, the peasants and workers. They considered themselves heroes. The terror of the Narodniks, volunteers prevented the revolutionary struggle of the masses, dispersed the forces of the workers and peasants, and led to an intensification of government reaction. The historical merit of the Narodniks of the 1970s was their selfless struggle against Tsarism and the landowners, their struggle for the transfer of all land to the peasants. But in this struggle the Narodniks defended not the socialist, but the bourgeois democratic positions. Lenin called the Narodniks of the 1970s petty bourgeois utopian socialists. 52. Working movement of the 70th anniversary. The First International and the revolutionary movement in Russia. The development of capitalism and the growth of the labor movement in all countries of Western Europe placed before the international proletariat the task of uniting for the struggle against capital. On September 28, 1864, the great proletarian leader Karl Marx, together with the advanced workers of the whole world, founded the International Workers' Association, or the First International. The purpose of the partnership was the common struggle of the workers of all countries for the abolition of the rule of capitalism and for the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The emancipation of the working class must be won by the working class itself, Marx wrote in the Statute of the First International. A group of Russian revolutionaries formed abroad the Russian section of the First International. In March 1870, they turned to Karl Marx with a request to be Russia's representative to the General Council of the International. Having accepted this proposal, Marx wrote to them in his reply that the task of eliminating Tsarism in Russia is a necessary condition for the liberation of not only the Russian people, but also the European proletariat. The revolutionary struggle of the Russian workers began at a time when in Western Europe the working class, led by Marx and Engels, created its class organizations, party, trade unions. Under the leadership of the First International, the European workers successfully waged strikes, fought against the power of capital. In 1871 the French workers overthrew the power of the bourgeoisie and proclaimed the Paris Commune. It was the first government of the working class, that is, the dictatorship of the proletariat. The Russian workers, from the first steps of their independent revolutionary struggle, declared their solidarity with the First International. In 1878, on the anniversary of the Paris Commune, the Odessa workers sent a greeting address to the Paris workers, declaring their solidarity with the Paris Communards. The programs, statutes and activities of Western European workers' organizations were examples for Russian workers. Strikes of the 70s. Russian revolutionary Narodniks assigned the proletariat a secondary role in the revolutionary movement. The Narodniks did not understand the importance of the class struggle of the proletariat. But the working class in Russia continued to grow steadily and entered a revolutionary struggle. Strikes broke out at enterprises spontaneously. In May 1870, in St. Petersburg, there was the first major strike on the Nevsky papers. Strand and spinners demanded an increase in wages and stood amicably behind each other. Only the arrests of the strikers and the betrayal of their trial the police managed to break the resistance of the workers. Since participation in the strike was considered a state crime, the workers' strikers were convicted by the Tsar's court. In 1872, an even more significant strike broke out at the Krengolmskaya manufactory. The strikers demanded a reduction in fines and a reduction in the working day for children who were subjected to monstrous exploitation at this factory. The strike was suppressed by the troops. At the same time, strikes began in Ukraine. In the strike at the Hughes factory in 1875, 1,500 workers took part. The strike of the Odessa railwaymen in 1877 lasted 3.5 weeks. In the 1970s, the struggle of the Georgian proletariat began. Thus, in the 60s-70s, spontaneous actions of workers in different parts of Russia begin. The first workers' revolutionaries. Among the workers, the first revolutionaries began to advance. One of them was Vasily Gerasimov, an active participant in the strike of 1872 at the Krengolmskaya manufactory. At his educational home, he started working at the factory from the age of 12. For revolutionary propaganda among soldiers and workers in St. Petersburg, Vasily Gerasimov was sentenced to 9 years of hard labor. In 1892, he died in Yakutsk. The notes left by him paint a serious picture of the life of Russian workers in the 60s and 70s and an awakening to the struggle. A remarkable worker revolutionary of the 70s was the participant of the populist circles, the Moscow weaver Peter Alexeyev, by origin Smolensk peasant. Simokoy Peter Alexeyev learned to read and read greedily in the books of answers to questions that concerned him about the situation of workers and peasants. Peter Alexeyev became a socialist. He led revolutionary agitation among the workers and moved from one factory to another to organize workers in revolutionary circles. Peter Alexeyev enjoyed very great authority, and his memory was long preserved among the Moscow weavers who lovingly called him Petruha. Arrested for revolutionary work, he delivered a speech at the trial on March 10, 1877, which ended with the words, "The muscular hand of millions of working people will smoke, and the yoke of despotism, guarded by soldiers' bayonets, will fly apart." Lenin regarded these words as a great prophecy of the Russian worker revolutionary. Peter Alexeyev was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor and then to a settlement in Yakutia. There in 1891, he was killed by robbers. The first workers' organizations. The first revolutionary working organization in Russia was the South Russian Workers' Union, founded in 1875 in Odessa by Evgeny Zaslavsky. The union aimed to propagate the ideas of the emancipation of workers from under the yoke of capital and privileged classes. The South Russian Workers' Union laid down the charter of the First International as the basis for its revolutionary activity. According to the statute of the Union, only workers could be its members. During this period a split occurred in a single, leading literature. From the editorial board of Silvermenik, who took the revolutionary democratic direction under the leadership of Chernyshevsky and Dobrolyubov, a number of noble writers left. In the ranks of revolutionary democracy there remained the poet Nekrasov and the great Russian writer and satirist Mikhail Evgrafovich Saltykov-Shchedrin, 1826–1889. He sharply and accurately portrayed in his works the exploitative aspirations of landlords and officials, as well as the nascent Russian bourgeoisie. In the history of a city, Saltykov gave a satirical depiction of the gallery of Russian czars and czars, their ministers, and also the very state system of Russia, and showed how much in common between Russia in the 60s and the old feudal Russia. In The Lord of the Golovlyovs and in the Hoshikhonsky Antiquity, Saltykov drew a vivid picture of the disintegration of serfdom. In the person of Judas, the Golovlyov's lord, the great satirist branded the type of double rascal scoundrel, whose classic representative in politics Lenin considered Trotsky's traitor. Lenin and Stalin, denouncing in their reports and articles bureaucratic dunces, liberal cowards, political rascals and adventurers, recall the images created by Saltykov. Saltykov's satirical work played a huge role in the development of the revolutionary movement in Russia. The darker realm of merchant despots, official bribe-takers and parasitic feudalists is shown in the plays of Ostrovsky, 1823–1885. Forest, Groza, profitable place, poverty is not a vice. Ostrovsky is the successor of Gogol. G. I. Uspensky, 1843–1902 showed the life of the oppressed laboring peasant masses with great truthfulness and sympathy, without hushing up the shadowy aspects of the life of the people, as the Narodnik folk artists usually did. In the 1950s, the great Russian writer Leo Tolstoy, 1828–1910, made his first works. In his brilliant works of art, War and Peace, Anna Karenina, Resurrection, and many others Tolstoy created, as Lenin said, incomparable pictures of Russian life. In them he gave merciless criticism of the high nobility of the nobility, capitalist and feudal exploitation, the oppression of Tsarism, the comedy of the court. For criticism of religious superstitions, Tolstoy in 1900 was excommunication from the Orthodox Church. In the novel, War and Peace, this greatest creation of Russian literature, a picture of the heroic struggle of the Russian people for their independence in 1812 is drawn. The dub of the People's War rose with all its formidable and majestic force, wrote Leo Tolstoy. She nailed the French until the whole invasion was lost. The novel is imbued with a deep faith in the creative forces and the unshakable courage of the great Russian people. In Sevastopol Stories, Tolstoy gave a remarkable description of the Crimean War, 1853-1856, to which he was a participant. Leo Tolstoy with great artistic power revealed human characters and developed the ideas of truth and justice. He mercilessly exposed the hypocrisy and deceitfulness of the moral foundations of the landowner bourgeois society in such works as the Kreutzer Sonata, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, The Living Corpse, The Resurrection, and others. Lenin wrote that the works of Tolstoy reflect the contradictions of Russian life the last third of the 19th century, that they are a mirror of the Russian Revolution. Tolstoy is great, as an exponent of those ideas and of the moods that were formed among millions of Russian peasants by the time the bourgeois revolution in Russia comes. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 15, p. 183. In the second half of his life, Tolstoy combined a direct and strong protest against public lies and falsehood with the preaching of non-resistance to evil by violence. This reactionary doctrine was called Tolstoyism. Art in the 60s. Democratic ideas are reflected in the visual arts. In the 60s, a group of graduate students of the Academy of Arts, protesting against state and reactionary teaching, left the Academy and subsequently founded the Association of Traveling Exhibitions. The organizer of the association was the artist Ian Kramskoy, 1837-1887. At the heart of his program was the idea of creating Russian national art. Art should be ideological and informative, it should be based on artistic realism. These principles were implemented by Kramskoy in his portraits of Leo Tolstoy, Saltykov-Shchedrin, Nekrasov, and others. The new trend put forward a whole galaxy of remarkable realist artists. They shared a common ideological and political orientation. With their art they defended the advanced ideas of revolutionary democracy for that time. A major role among these artists was played by V.G. Perov, 1833-1882, who created many pictures of civil motives, The Funeral of the Peasant, The Three, and others. The largest representative of Peredvayanichestvo was Ilya Efimovich Repin, 1844-1930. His paintings with deep realism reflected the plight of the working masses, Burlaki on the Volga, the unfolding revolutionary struggle, the arrest of the propagandist, strong human experiences, not weighted. Repin was also a remarkable portraitist. 60, 70 years are remarkable for the success of Russian music. The leading group of composers was the so-called Mighty Handful, led by the student of Glinka, M. Abulakirov, 1836-1910. The literary ideologist and propagandist of the Mighty Heap was a music and art critic, V. V. Stazov, 1824-1906. The composers of the Mighty Pile continued the work of Glinka and Dargomishsky on creating Russian musical art based on folk music. With the genius of the creative principles of the Mighty Handful are expressed in the works of M. P. Mussorgsky, 1839-1881. He created two remarkable musical dramas, Boris Godunov and Kavanchkina, in which the active people are the Russian people. The songs and romances of Mussorgsky are of tremendous importance as examples of musical characteristics saturated with deep drama. Another remarkable Russian composer, A. P. Borodin, 1833, 1887, in his work, reproduced the characteristic features of Russian music and the musical culture of the East. Borodin wrote a heroic and patriotic monumental opera, Prince Igor, on the plot of the great work, The Lay of Igor's Host, masterfully using the songs and dances of the Russian people and peoples of the East. The symphonies of Borodin were a significant stage in the development of the national Russian symphonic style of the XX century. The pupils of Balakirev, the outstanding composer Rimsky-Korsakov, 1844–1908, the author of the operas May Night, The Snow Maiden, Sadko, The Tale of the Golden Cockerel and others, as well as the symphonic poem Scheherazade, was a remarkable teacher who brought up several generations of Russian, Ukrainian, Georgian, Armenian musicians and composers. The activity of the composers of the mighty pile laid the foundation for the wide influence of Russian music on the world art. The 60s were marked by a struggle for Russian musical enlightenment, for the general availability of musical art, for musical professionalism. A huge influence on the development of musical culture was founded in the 60 years by the brothers A and N Rubinstein Petersburg and Moscow Conservatory, which were the first higher musical educational institutions in Russia. In the 70s, the leading Russian theater was the Moscow Maly Theater, which preserved the best covenants of Shchukin's theatrical realism. In the 70 years, the flowering of the creative work of such two remarkable actresses as Emma Nurmalova and G.N. Fedotov, and the largest actor of that time, Pravnik Pavlovich Sadovsky, is falling. Ermolov's images of Katerina, Ostrovsky's Thunderstorm, Joan of Arc, The Orleans Maiden by Schiller sounded from the stage of the theater as a call to fight. The Maly Theater has staged all of Ostrovsky's plays in which Russian actors have shown the world the power of their talents. 54. Culture of the peoples of Tsar Russia in the 60s–70s. The persecution of the peoples inhabiting the national regions of Russia by the Tsarism always aroused the protest of the Russian revolutionaries, beginning with Radishchev. Ukrainian, Georgian, Armenian, Tatar writers, artists, musicians went to study at Russian universities. They became followers of the Russian enlighteners, Belinsky, Chernyshevsky, Dobroliubov, and together with them fought against Tsarism. The growth of capitalism in the national regions of Russia led to the formation of nations in Georgia, Ukraine and other regions of the empire. This process was accompanied by the development of national culture. However, Russia remained a prison of nations. Tsarism acted as a strangler of the national culture of non-Russian peoples. The Ukrainian nation was fighting class forces. One direction reflected the interests of the Ukrainian democratic circles, the interests of the broad masses of the people. It acted in close connection with advanced Russian culture, with the revolutionary forces of the Russian people. Another direction, Ukrainian bourgeois nationalists, sought to tear off the Ukrainian people from the Russian people. Ukrainian nationalists advanced the idea of the bourgeois nationlessness of the Ukrainian nation, and opposed the unity of the interests of the entire Ukrainian people against the class struggle. Some Ukrainian nationalists, in their hatred of the Russian people, proclaimed the orientation of the Ukrainian people to the West, sought to tear it away from Russia, from the Russian people, and sold the Ukrainian people into slavery to the ruling classes of Germany, who for centuries dreamed of seizing Ukraine. In 1863, the Tsarist government issued a circular prohibiting the publication of pedagogical literature and textbooks in the Ukrainian language. The circular said, "There was not a little Russian language, there cannot be." The circular declared that the Ukrainian language is the same Russian language, only spoiled by the influence of the Polish language. The Tsarist government arrested and exiled the activists of the Ukrainian Enlightenment of the 60s. In 1857, the Narysh Opozovshchina was written by the writer Margot Vovchak, M. Valinskaya, 1834–1907. In 1859 they were published in Russian by Turgenev. In many of her works, the writer made an ardent protest against serfdom. Her work was highly appreciated by Chernyshevsky, Dobrolyubov, Shevchenko. The hard life of the Ukrainian peasants after the reform was reflected in his works by Panis Myrny, Rudchenko 1849-1920. In 1880 he published his novel, She-6E, Howling the Wolf, Yak Jashl Povn1, the first great social novel in Ukrainian literature, which reveals the deep class contradictions after the reform of 1861. The novel gives the image of a poor peasant Chutka, who fights against begging for a better life and dies in exile in Siberia. In his novel Povia, 1863 shows a terrible share of the peasant woman, who remained in the city without work. Frightened by the growth of the Ukrainian national liberation movement, the government strengthened the persecution of the Ukrainian language. In 1876, a secret decree confirmed the prohibition to print works in Ukrainian and perform them on stage. During the development of industrial capitalism, the Ukrainian bourgeoisie sought to create its own political organizations and develop its own political program. For this purpose, it created a so-called Gromada, which united a large group of Ukrainian bourgeois intelligentsia. Especially active was the Kiev community, which was headed in the 70s and 80s by V. Antonovich and M. Dragomanov. The Narodniks had a strong influence on the activities of the communities. One of the most active ideologists of the Ukrainian bourgeoisie was Dragomanov. He put forward the program of the Federation of Free Communities, the masses, which must enter the Federation of Slavic Peoples. Dragomanov defended the idea of bourgeois national cultural autonomy. In the early 80s Dragomanov went abroad, where he propagandized the ideas of the Ukrainian bourgeois nationalist movement. V.T. Antonovich went further than Dragomanov along the way of nationalism. In the 80s, Antonovich came up with the idea of joining Dnieper Ukraine to Western Ukraine under the rule of the Austrian monarchy. In this question Antonovich disagreed with Dragomanov, who was a determined opponent of Ukraine's accession to Austria and stood for rapprochement with Russia. Since the first half of the 20th century, began to grow and strengthen the bourgeois national movement in Galicia. A wide campaign was launched for the opening of the school in the native Ukrainian language. In Lviv University, Ukrainian departments were established. In Lviv, the scientific association named after Shevchenko was opened. This society printed works of Ukrainian scientists, since in Russia until 1905 it was impossible to print books in the Ukrainian language. It was engaged in studying the history of the Ukrainian people, its ethnography and literature, but in the direction of this society there were bourgeois nationalist tendencies. The founder of the New Georgian literature was Ilya Chavchavadze, 1837-1907. Chavchavadze's world outlook was formed under the influence of Belinsky, Dobrolyubov and Chernyshevsky. In his works and in the journals he published, he pursued the ideas of enlightenment. Chavchavadze abruptly skirted serfdom and sang of peasant labor, Robert Keiko, the story of a beggar. Simultaneously, Chavchavadze shows in these works the degeneration of the nobility, the oppression of the peasants. The most famous is the story of Chavchavadze, Is He Human? In an effort to acquaint Georgians with Russian literature, Chavchavadze printed translations of Dobrolyubov, Belinsky and other Russian writers. The journal Chavchavadze, Bulletin of Georgia, was the center of the educational movement among Georgians. Chavchavadze throughout his life fought for the development of Georgian culture, boldly speaking against Tsarism. In 1907 the Tsarist authorities organized the murder of Chavchavadze by the hands of hired bandits. The importance of Chavchavadze in the development of Georgian literature is enormous. He is the creator and classics of modern Georgian literary language and literature. Since the late 1960s, in Georgia, as opposed to the group of Chavchavadze, the so-called first group, or Pervilidasi, who believed that the leading cultural part of the Georgian people was the educated nobility, a new literary group arose that called itself Miordazi, the second group. In the development of trade and industry, she saw a means of national revival of Georgia. In the 90s, The group entered the path of serving the big bourgeoisie and supporting Russian Tsarism. In the 50s-60s, the magazine Severnoye Suyani was published in Moscow, which aimed to develop Armenian literature and familiarize Armenians with Russian and Western European literature. With the same tasks, the Armenian newspaper Rabotnik was founded in Tiflis in 1872. The largest Armenian writer of this period was G. Sundokian, 1825-1912, the author of several plays from the life of Armenian merchants, nicknamed Armenian Ostrovsky. One of his best works is Pepo. In the 70s, the first recorded record was the heroic Armenian folk epic, David Sasunsky. Followers of Russian enlighteners in Kazakhstan were Kazakh poet Abay Kazunanbayev, the first Kazakh scientist Shokan Velikanov, and Kazakh poet-teacher Ibrahim Tinsarin. Kazakh poet Abay Kazunanbayev, 1845-1897, was the founder of the Kazakh literary language. In his works, Abay scourged the negative aspects of the patriarchal feudal way of life of the people, exposed the greed and treachery of Volos governors and officials. Abay translated the works of Pushkin, Lermontov and Krylov into Kazakh. With his appeal to the culture of Russia, Western Europe and the East, the Kazakh poet enriched the spiritual world of his people with new ideas. In deep and close fellowship with advanced Russian people and with Russian culture, Kazunanbayev saw the only sure way out of the darkness of his era. In his poems he sought to inspire the Kazakh people that it is necessary to separate the Russian people from the Tsarist colonizers. He educated and instilled in the Kazakh people the ideas of brotherhood and friendship of peoples. The Kazakh scientist Shokan Velikanov, 1837-1866, saw social inequality among the Kazakhs. He was aware of the opposition of the interests of the working masses, on the one hand, and of the sultans and beys, on the other. Shokan Velikanov was a defender of the interests of the people and a sincere democrat. His work on the history of the Kazakh and Kyrgyz peoples, on the study of the geography of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and Kashgar had great scientific significance. Velikanov's dream was the rapprochement of the Russian and Kazakh peoples. Kazakh poet Ibrahim Tinsarin, 1841-1889, was a supporter of broad public education. In his works he called the Kazakh people to education and culture. All his life he gave the organization of public education. Ibrahim Tinsarin is credited with compiling the first Kazakh alphabet on the basis of Russian graphics. The beginning of the fight against the working class against Tsarism, 1881-1899. 55. Political reaction. The Noble Reaction. After the assassination of Alexander II by the Narodnaya Volya, his son Alexander III, 1881-1894, became king, in which the people began to live even worse. After the assassination of Alexander II, a meeting was convened on the reforms proposed by Loris Melikov. In these conditions of a tense customs war, the Treaty of 1887 was not renewed. The non-resumption of the Russo-German Treaty and the customs war with Germany, the serious contradictions between Russia and England, internal economic difficulties, all this created a difficult situation for Russia. In 1891-1892 years, Russia was struck by a severe famine, which led to further frustration of already heavily upset public finances. Taking into account the growing aggression of imperialist Germany, which has increased especially since the coming to power of Wilhelm II, while simultaneously experiencing an acute need for capital, Tsarism was to make an alliance with the Republican France. In addition to financial assistance, the French government also undertook the task of policing the Russian political émigrés in France. Soon Russian Tsarism turned into a dependent debtor of French bankers. In 1891-1893 years, a number of treaties established the Franco-Russian Union, in which Tsarism occupied a subordinate position. Tsarist Russia undertook to expose 800,000 soldiers against Germany in the event of Germany's attack on France. Describing the role of Tsarist Russia as the greatest reserve of Western imperialism, J.V. Stalin wrote that Russia was such a reserve. not only in the sense that it gave free access to foreign capital holding such decisive branches of the national economy of Russia, as fuel and metallurgy, but also in the sense that it could put millions of soldiers in favor of the Western imperialists. Stalin, Questions of Leninism, 11th ed., p. 5. Having suffered defeat in the Middle East in its predatory aspirations, Tsarism since the beginning of the 1990s directed its offensive to the Far East. The construction of the Siberian Railway begins here, the seizure of Korea and Manchuria is being prepared. 56. Beginning fight for the Marxist Party in Russia. Morozovsky staged the Emancipation of Labor group. In 1872, the first volume of Marx's work, Capital, was published in the Russian translation, and immediately prohibited by the Tsarist censorship. Marxism is the theory and tactics of the proletariat. The proletariat in Russia in the 1970s was still being formed, and therefore the ideas of Marxism in Russia could not then be widely disseminated among the workers. In 1883, the first Russian Marxist organization, the Emancipation of Labor Group, was founded abroad in Geneva, Switzerland by Plekhanov. The group consisted of Vera Zizalik, Pavel Axelrod and others. In 1884, the first Marxist Social Democratic group arose in St. Petersburg under the leadership of Blagoev, the future leader of the Bulgarian Communists. Blagoev's group acted in Russia simultaneously and independently of Plekhanov's group. Georgy Valentinovich Plekhanov, 1856-1918, a prominent Russian Marxist, was at first a populist. Persecuted by Tsarism, he emigrated abroad. The study of the works of Marx and Engels, the study of the causes of the collapse of Narodism and the experience of the struggle of Western European workers, and the success of revolutionary propaganda among Russian workers led Plekhanov to Marxism. In 1883, Plekhanov published the book, Socialism and Political Struggle, and in 1885 another book, Our Disagreements. Plekhanov with his works inflicted a serious blow to the Narodniks. He showed that Russia had already entered the capitalist path of development, and this refuted the basic position of the Narodniks that Russia could, as it were, escape the capitalist path of development. Plekhanov also broke the erroneous theory of the Narodniks about the dominant role of heroes in the history of the loners and showed that this theory is an idealistic theory and has nothing in common with the concrete historical reality. The group, Liberation of Labor p. V. Plekhanov, yes, theoretically and ideologically paved the way for the social democratic movement in Russia. With the publication of a number of works by Marx and Engels, the Manifesto of the Communist Party, Wage Labor and Capital, the development of socialism from utopia to science, and others, she did a great job of spreading Marxism in Russia. Plekhanov himself was a brilliant popularizer of the materialist understanding of history and a profound critic of all idealistic theories in Russia and Western Europe. On his philosophical works, generations of Russian Marxists were brought up. Plekhanov's struggle against Narodism and the propaganda of Marxism paved the way for the emergence of a Marxist Social Democratic Party in Russia. But the Emancipation of Labor group denied the revolutionary forces and abilities of the peasantry as an ally of the proletariat. The Emancipation of Labor group incorrectly claimed that the liberal bourgeoisie was an ally of the proletariat in the revolutionary struggle. Already in the 80s the leaders of the group expressed their views, which subsequently led to Menshevism. The group was completely divorced from the struggle of workers in Russia. Lenin characterized this stage of the struggle for the Marxist Party. Social democracy existed without a labor movement, experiencing, like a political party, the process of uterine development. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 5, p. 483. The Morozov Strike of 1885. The labor movement in Russia also developed during the industrial crisis of the 1980s. It was still spontaneous and put forward only economic demands. Since the beginning of the 1980s, strikes took place at the Yartsevo manufactory, Smolensk province, in Ivanovo-Voznesensk, in the Żyrardowskaya in Poland, and at the Kręgomskie manufactory. Over 8,000 workers worked at the Mrozov factory in Orkowo-Zujów. Operation at the Mrozov manufactory was especially predatory. Since 1882, in connection with the crisis, Mrozov began to reduce wages and until 1884 made 5 penalties. At the same time, the workers were being fined. They were all over the factory. Accounted for almost a quarter of earnings, 24 kopecks per earned ruble. Individual workers received fines of up to half their earnings. The average wage of the weaver was 4,184 kopecks per day in 1884. But the worker did not receive wages at his hands, since, due to his future earnings, he, due to necessity, borrowed rotten products in a factory shop on credit at a high price. On the exploitation of workers, Mrozov earned annually up to 500,000 rubles in income. Not knowing how to fight, the workers tolerated this bondage, but among them grew ferment and discontent. In 1884 a new weaver arrived at the factory, Pyotr Nasimovich Moisenko. He had just returned from exile, where he was exiled in 1879 as a member of the Northern Union of Russian Workers for his participation in the St. Petersburg strikes. Moisenko, along with another former member of the Northern Union, Luka Ivanov, and the young worker Vasily Volkov, launched revolutionary agitation among the workers. Together they worked out the requirements that the workers had to present to Mrozov. After preliminary secret discussions, the demands were finally approved by the advance factory workers. At 6 a.m. on January 7, 1885, one of the workers, on a preliminary conspiracy, shouted, "Today is a holiday. Finish work, extinguish the gas. Women, come out." The whole factory stopped. The workers' long-held hatred of the oppressors broke through for a long time. Despite Moisenko's and Volkov's persuasions, the workers destroyed the hatchery shop they hated with worm products and smashed the manager's apartment. The frightened administration summoned the governor and the troops. The governor categorically demanded an immediate end to the strike. Volkov, on behalf of the workers, presented him and the administration with pre-established requirements. The main one was the cancellation of arbitrary fines. The workers told the governor, according to the state law issued, the owner should not produce excessive fines, which burden his workers. We, the workers, demand and ask that the fines do not exceed 5% of the earned ruble. We are half-starved. We want to work and go, but give us the opportunity to feed the family. Administration did not make concessions. The workers continued the strike. Then, on the personal order of Alexander III, mass arrests of the strikers began. When Volkov was taken, he shouted to the assembled workers, "Am I for all or all for me?" "All, all." The workers answered amicably and rushed to beat the arrested man away from the Cossacks. When this failed, they all went to the authorities and demanded, "Free Vesk, our man." Due to the arrest of 600 active strikers after the 8-day resistance, the strike was broken. Moisenko, Luka Ivanov, Vasily Volkov and other active leaders of the strike were brought to trial. But at court such monstrous orders were found out in the Mrozov factory, that even specially selected jurors were forced to recognize the innocence of Moisenko and his comrades. The royal court acquitted them. However, Alexander III ordered the immediate sending to administrative exile justified by the court. Moisenko, the outstanding worker revolutionary Moisenko, continued the revolutionary struggle throughout his life. He was a participant in the October Revolution of 1917 and during the Civil War fought for Soviet power in the ranks of the Red Army. Moisenko died in 1923 as a member of the Bolshevik Party. The Mrozov strike greatly frightened Alexander III and his ministers, so in 1886 a law was issued on fines and settlement books. According to this law, fines were to be paid not to the benefit of the manufacturers, as before, but to the needs of the workers themselves. However, in fact, The factory owners circumvented this law in every possible way. Even earlier, a factory inspection was established to oversee the factories. The Morozov strike was of tremendous significance for the development of the revolutionary struggle of the working class. It marked the beginning of the mass labor movement. The spontaneity of the preceding strikes began to be replaced by organized workers' speeches. The demands of the strikers sounded no longer pathetic pleas and requests, but the imperious demands of a new, revolutionary class that began to realize its social role. The Morozov strike showed the solidarity and comradely solidarity of the workers. In the words of the reactionary Katkov, the strike showed to Tsarism, "It's dangerous to joke with the masses of the people." In this strike the proletariat of Russia emerged as the foremost force of the revolutionary movement. For the first time in the history of Russia, the revolutionary action of the workers forced Tsarism to make concessions and carry out a law on the settlement of fines. The first social democratic worker circles in Russia. From the late 80s and early 90s among the advanced workers emerged the first in Russia, social democratic circles. These circles were led by representatives of the social democratic intelligentsia. In social democratic circles, Fedosiev and Kazin, Brezhnev and Petersburg, etc., the workers studied the works of Marx, Engels and the history of the labor movement. In 1891, a group of advanced workers in St. Petersburg, the first social democrats, brought to the dying writer N.V. Shelgunov, a colleague of N.G. Chernyshevsky, the address in which they thanked Shelgunov for his selfless struggle against Tsarism. At the funeral of N.V. Shelgunov, the same group of workers laid a wreath on behalf of the workers of St. Petersburg and turned the funeral into a political demonstration against the government. The same group organized in 1891 the first village in St. Petersburg, which was attended by several dozen of the most active and advanced workers. All of them secretly gathered on a wooded island on the Neva River. 4 workers made speeches, calling for a struggle against the autocracy in capital. One of the speakers, the weaver Afanasayev, warmly urged the workers to organize and fight. "We will learn, unite ourselves, comrades, we will organize ourselves into a strong party."